All right, I'm going to do this video to go over loading and driving off the mound. You know, there's different schools of thought. I did a video showing different drive leg styles. Basically, there's rotators, there's knee slammers, there's triple extenders. There's also a big school of thought of leading with the hip. Of course, you do lead with the hip. You don't want to lead with the head or the shoulders. I mean, potentially you don't want to. There's shades of gray there. But if you're leading with the hip, there's that school of thought to really aggressively hip lead, right? Create that little V. The problem is and what we're falling into, guys that do that, I've had come in here with a lot of arm injury. And I've found just through working with them that a lot of the links are to this aggressive hip lead. And then it even comes down to those guys typically don't even believe about generating force off the rubber. They just want to aggressively hip lead and fall to front foot strike. The problem is really the essence of not only getting force to front foot, because in lifting you could lead with the hip and you could hit front foot really aggressively. It's really the problem of getting the hips to come through, just like a hitter. A hitter wouldn't want to shift his weight and his hips stay here and just the hands go. Driving the hips through ahead of the back shoulder, ahead of the hands in the back, there's elasticity here. It helps drive the rest of the chain. It helps drive the trunk through. Basically, this hip helps drive this shoulder. So these guys that want to go in these aggressive hip leads, they hit front foot and they're stuck here. They collapse. They collapse here and they're stuck. And then when their trunks go, there's not very much separation between the hips and shoulders, and then the arm is having to or the trunk's having to pull across through the oblique side, the glove side, the head pull, and then the arm's having to horizontally abduct and pull down, and then that's where the arm problems come in, because the arm's having to overcompensate for the hip not getting through and driving the chain up, or driving that energy up the chain. And the reason I want to bring Jimmy out, the reason these aggressive hip leads are shutting the hip rotation down and causing guys to overcompensate with their arms, is because if you take the femur, so if we look at Jimmy here, if you take the femur in the acetabulum, which is in the hip socket, if we are to aggressively hip lead, so say he's on the rubber right now, if he is aggressively to lift this leg and push that hip forward, what happens is this hip abducts or becomes superior to this hip. And as it abducts, or this adducts to move down. And what happens is, as the hip keeps leading, you create an impingement between the femur and the hip. You hit a point where you can't go any farther. And then what happens, as you can see here, as he would get into this position, he'd be kind of leaning back at this point. You create a point where there's really no rotation unless you're swinging the whole leg around. It's really hard for the femur to internally rotate from this really aggressive abducted position. It's because it's impinged, it's jammed. It's going to be hard for it to want to internally rotate, which would allows the hip to go through. So if you're aggressively leaning through the hip, you're going to hit a point where you quickly hit end of range, which most of them do. They still get a ton of momentum going, but they're unable to create rotation out of that impinged, hyper abducted position of the femur. That's why you have to understand, hip rotation will only occur from flexion, because it's a flexion extension movement, meaning that the hips will counter rotate, so the femur can flex or come up. Sorry, this is a little twisted. So it can flex and come up, so the hips actually have to go back. And from that flex position of the hip, that's what creates extension through the hip as well. So if you almost want to do the opposite. You almost want to keep your hip, let me just show it on myself. You almost want to keep your hip back, so you're in flexion. If you try to go forward into abduction, then you're going to get into that impinged position. So you almost want to do this to the opposite. You do want to lead through the hips, but you don't want to push into abduction here. You want to sit into the glutes, into the external rotators, and hold that position as your momentum starts to fall, and stay in flexion. So when you get to a point where your force vector, your ankle to knee is linear, you can then drive into extension, internal rotation. So that hip's going to want to rotate better than from a hyper abducted position. It's going to want to collapse here, and I can't rotate. So that's the problem that I'm seeing in these approaches that want to aggressively hip lead. These approaches that want to aggressively hip lead are just jamming their guys into impingement, enabling rotation, and then they're forcing themselves to overcompensate. So you can lead through the hip, you just can't unload the back hip when you do it. And unloading that would be just collapsing. You have to lead through the hip, but flex the back hip, sit into the glute, ride that down, and then through extension of the leg, you're going to go into extension of the hip, and ultimately that's triple extension. So I wanted to put that together to help guys understand to be careful in those approaches, and also understand that you're not going to, if force production is important at front foot, but you're not going to get much hip rotation out of those aggressive hip leads. I hope that makes sense. If you have any questions, reach out to me.